Today's conversation is why addiction is a spiritual problem. So the premise is all addiction comes from a deep spiritual longing. And when we do mind-altering substances, it is an attempt to fill a spiritual void. And the reason we feel this spiritual void is because we have forgotten our true nature. And our true nature is bliss, peace, and happiness. So these substances, they make us feel this blissful state and remind us of what we are truly seeking. And so the remedy for this is spiritual awakening. And so I will expand on these topics more in the video. But first I want to talk about a story. And it is about a man named Roland Hazard III. So he was a wealthy American and he struggled with severe alcoholism. And this is in the 1930s. Despite seeking help from the best medical professionals of the time, he was not able to overcome this addiction. Eventually, he sought the treatment of Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychiatrist. He was known for exploring the psychological and spiritual dimensions of the human psyche. So, after seeing him, Jung concluded that Roland's case was hopeless through traditional medical or psychological methods. He told him that his alcoholism was not just physical or psychological, but was actually a spiritual problem. And so he explained that the only way to overcome this addiction was through going through a profound spiritual transformation, what you would call a metanoia. And metanoia means a change in your mind, change in your consciousness. So Jung explained that awakenings like this could sometimes occur spontaneously or as a result of embracing a spiritual or religious path, often catalyzed by complete surrender from hitting rock bottom. Roland began to seek the spiritual solution to his problems, and he joined a group called the Oxford Group, a Christian fellowship focused on spiritual renewal and moral accountability. And this completely transformed him, helped him to overcome his addiction, and this eventually led to the formation of the 12-step program, which you find in Alcoholics Anonymous. And since then, this reliance on a higher power, taking moral accountability, this turning to a spiritual group has helped millions of people overcome their addiction. Essentially, what we find is this spiritual transformation is all we need, because when we do that, we find what we're looking for. So what is it that we're looking for? Well, I remember when I did psychedelics, I experimented when I was younger, and they brought me to the path. I just remember being in a state, feeling like everything was clear. Everything was connected, and nature was alive. Life was much more simple than I used to think it was. There was no need to suffer. And I asked myself, how can I feel like this all the time? And that was the beginning of my spiritual path, was there must be a way to feel this way all the time without the use of any external substance. And long story short, I did end up meeting my teacher as well as a few others. And the results are that it is true. You can feel that way all the time. And this is why we have teachings of the Buddha or the Taoist internal alchemy. This is why we have the rosary. This is why we have the pranayama of the yogis. Because all of these spiritual practices generate bliss and they calm our mind. They bring us to a state of peace. And then if we can transcend the higher levels of consciousness, like what the Buddha talks with enlightenment, we can experience things far greater than any psychedelic could ever offer us. So there's the story of Ram Dass, and he was working with Timothy Leary and doing LSD experiments. And he went to India, and he met his spiritual teacher, Neem Karoli Baba. And his teacher said, do you have any of that yogi medicine? And so he took a very large dose from Ram Dass. And it didn't do anything to him. And he just kind of laughed. And then there was, some time went by, and Ram Dass thought maybe the yogi was faking it. But he asked Ram Dass again, and then he made sure Ram Dass saw him take this large dose of LSD that would make most people go pretty crazy. And once again, it didn't affect him. And what he told Ram Dass was, this when you take this, you can probably have a vision of the Christ, what they call darshan. But it'll only last for a little while, and then you have to come back. And he said, it might have some benefit to take this, but actually, why have a vision of Christ when you can just become Christ? And what he means is practice the path of the yogi. And as you might know, yoga means union. So you're practicing the path of union. And what are you uniting to? Well, the yogis call this Saccidananda, which means truth, consciousness, and bliss. Saccidananda is the subjective experience of the supreme, unchanging reality. The spiritual saints all across all the traditions report the same experience of bliss, ecstasy, and peace. Just look up the painting The Ecstasy of St. Francis, or read poems by Rumi, or read stories of famous Taoists that used to live. They all report the same thing: ecstasy, bliss, and peace, because they're all experiencing this subjective experience of the supreme, unchanging reality. And to take it even further, look at Shiva. Shiva is depicted with cannabis. Cannabis is associated with him. And it's not because as a Shiva follower you're supposed to smoke weed. It's to show this intoxication of the divine. Or look at the Greek god Dionysus. It's a more direct representation of the ecstasy of the supreme, being the god of wine. And then we see Jesus turning water into wine, a bland, flavorless substance into a drink that intoxicates you. And you can find many more examples. Odin with his mead. Many more examples of the divine being associated with intoxication. Even in Plato, if you're familiar with Plato, in his Phaedrus, he talks about the four ecstasies. And he says the highest level of ecstasy is that of the lovers. And by lover, he means the philosopher, the person who reaches a contemplative union with the divine. So this ecstasy, this bliss, it transcends culture. It transcends religion itself. It is inherent to our very nature as a human being. So what we see is our body has what is called the endocannabinoid system. Our body naturally produces cannabinoids, like one that's really well known called anandamide. If you remember, Saccidananda has the same root word. And they call this the bliss molecule. And this has been seen to be active when somebody does take mind-altering substances. But it's also been shown that we can naturally produce it or activate it through different activities. The first time I heard of this was when I was studying the flow state, and it was found in high-performance athletes or people who are basically in a flow state. Well, I would guarantee that if we were to do brain scans of people doing spiritual practices, we would also find this bliss molecule being activated. And if we find somebody who is an advanced spiritual practitioner, I imagine that you would find this bliss molecule or these endocannabinoid receptors active at all times during the day. And so this clearly shows that when we activate these receptors exogenously, we are just supplementing what we can do endogenously. And what I mean by that is we can do this ourselves. We don't need mind-altering substances to activate this. And so the way we do this is we go about adopting a spiritual practice. Now, it must be said that it's not enough to just go to church. We have to have some sort of practice that will create a very deep and profound change within us. So what does this mean? Well, if you are going the Christian route, you want to do practices like the rosary or the Jesus prayer or prostrations. If you've ever heard of the hesychastic prayer, that is the prayer of silence. If you want to go the yogi route, do breath work, which is called pranayam, or japa, which is their form of prayer. Or you can do puja, which is the light offerings or the fire rituals. And then there's the Sufi prayer circles. You can join one of those. You can do the salat. Or you can do Tibetan Buddhist tantric practices, which involves breath work like the Tumo. Or you can do the Buddhist loving kindness meditations like Om Mani Padme Hum. There are so many options out there. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of spiritual practices you can adopt. The goal is to pick the one that you feel the affinity towards, the one that you have the karmic affinity towards, the one that you feel the connection to, because that's the one that you'll stick with and do every day, and that's the one that you'll make all the progress in. You can also do contemplative work, like silent meditation, which you find in Zen Buddhism or Theravadan Buddhism. So the goal is to find the path that you feel connected to, find a teacher if you can, and then immerse yourself in this. And now keep in mind that the goal of all spiritual practice is to teach us to surrender to a higher power. So when we do these practices, we are practicing surrendering and letting go. And when we do this, the higher power, which is full of infinite wisdom and is goodness itself, we come closer and closer to it because love is a uniting force. We practice these practices that generate love for this goodness. And by uniting with it, we become more and more good. We become more and more fulfilled and at peace. And then we eventually reflect what our true nature is: bliss, peace, and even ecstasy. So I hope you enjoyed this talk. And with that, I will leave you with a quote. What the addict is seeking is not to be ashamed of. The whole spiritual world wants to reach that blissful state of consciousness. Change your technique, not your aspiration. The state doesn't have to be sought. It is always within us. Dr. David Hawkins. Thanks for listening.